Hello! Uh, Hello and welcome back again. Today we're going to, well, go over a bit of the previous series, and I'm going to talk a bit more extensively about the Battle of Mohacs and have a more of an interactive session, hopefully, and my head is twitching. Just a second. uh, yeah, I think that sorts it out. Okay. Hello, hello, you two. How are you? uh, oh boy. Uh, I hope I'm being heard and seen and everything. That the audio is coming through. I don't think that my head is twitching because of that. No. uh. Okay. Okay, everyone. Just need to arrange my notes here, and well, as anybody who's seen the series has seen, the Battle of Mohacs of 1526 is one of the biggest disasters in military history. Not just military history, but probably geopolitical history at all, because it wasn't just a military failure, it was a systemic failure. And because usually the life of King Louis II gets reduced to, in most history books, it is 2 pages. Like in most general history books, you will get 2 pages on Louis II. He succeeds his father, he is maltreated, he marries a Habsburg, he loses at Mohacs. That is basically the 2-page history of Louis II. But what precedes him is decades of a system that just doesn't work for that isn't fit for purpose for the defense of the realm. And this isn't just something that's just seen in those last decades, it is something that shows up from the very start. We can go as far back to the first Battle of Kosovo. Okay, yeah, that's nicely seen there. Where the first Battle of Kosovo in 1389, if I get paranoid about years. Yeah, 1389. The first Battle of Kosovo field in 1389 is arguably a victory of the Christian forces, despite the modern tendency, especially in the Serbian historiography, to treat it as a defeat. It ends with the killing of the Sultan, and the King of Bosnia, who sent troops to Kosovo field, is congratulated on his great victory by the Florentine Republic. That is one of the letters that is sent. It is not contemporaneously seen as a disaster or as a defeat. It achieved what it was meant to achieve. It killed the Sultan, which is something that all successive battles will fail. The problem is that the first Kosovo field, also doesn't exactly succeed at this point, because the Ottoman Empire is very quick to recover. It doesn't collapse into disaster. It doesn't collapse into disaster because the succession from Sultan Murad is secure. It is only after Timur the Lame defeats the Ottoman Sultan at the Battle of Angora that the empire descends into civil war, but that is not exploited. But it's not exploited because prior to the Battle of Angora, the Battle of Ankara, is the great disaster of Nicopolis. The great disaster of Nicopolis under under the many leaders of the Nicopolis Crusade, mainly sponsored by King Sigismund of Luxembourg. And Nicopolis is one of those where the complete dysfunction of the decentralized feudal army is seen. There is no level of cooperation that allows for the campaign or the battle to be successful, because you are dealing a feudal army is dealing against a centralized army, a centralized foe under a central command of the Sultan that is almost completely and utterly obedient to the Sultan. And this battle leaves Sigismund partially traumatized, I would say, that he just tries to arrange for the defense of the South without ever again engaging in an offensive manner. He also has other interests that take over in his. He also has other interests that take over when he's leading campaigns into Bohemia and competing and jockeying for the imperial throne and having to deal with other matters in Central Europe, such as the Western Schism and then the Hussite Rebellion. Oh, well, I saw a message there, then it disappeared. I think I saw something about Jagiellonian kings, so I will answer that later if you'll repost it. But I think I got the gist of it. But I'll continue for now to not get bogged down. Oh yeah. It's all right. The Battle of Nicopolis is the last effort made by Sigismund von Luxembourg in an offensive manner to try and compete with the Ottomans, and it is a big coalition, but it is a disaster, and it is something that will be on almost repeat as we go through the century. So from Nicopolis to 40 years on during the reign of King Sigismund, there is no real offensive. He is just on the defensive with regards to the Ottomans. He tries to arrange for the buffer state system, buffer princedom system, which just starts to collapse. It's the whole thing with the Order of the Dragon and the reason why Dracula gets his name and those sorts of things, where these princedoms along the border are tied to Sigismund in a way with their only job being to defend his realm from the Ottomans, and that collapses because of the Ottoman raids and the Ottoman encroachment that is incessant. When that starts failing, Sigismund turns to the secondary system and starts to build up that system of fortresses. It's the beginning of that system of fortresses that will start to defend the realm for the rest of the century. After the first big effort against the Ottomans after that is, of course, the disaster of the campaign at Varna, which is probably the closest that the Christian forces were to victory if there was no shenanigans and delay. As I've said it was almost 2 years ago now, with the whole the dirty deal made between George Brankovic and Janos Hunyadi in order to delay and not forgetting forgetting the cardinal there and even the king, where they are basically delay a successful campaign enough for the Ottoman army to show up in force across and face the enemy at Varna. which also means, and you also have the big ambiguity of what the hell was going on with the supposed naval contingent of the great merchant republics that were supposed to block that crossing. And it is a disaster, again, of complete lack of cooperation, shenanigans, backdoor dealings, and just utter deceit with regards to the Sultan, with regards to promising the Sultan something that, well, that you're not going to carry through out deliberately. It's the false peace of Varna that is said to have been nailed to the Ottoman banner during the battle. Again, it's a attempt to lead a completely decentralized force against a centralized enemy. Then we have the second Battle of Kosovo field, that is also a defeat, that is not exactly a failure of cooperation on the previous scales. It's much smaller, but it is a campaign that János Hunyadi is more or less forced to attempt to lead, and it is a dangerous thing that doesn't work. It's an insufficient force at that point, and there's no meeting up with the Albanian forces and other things that are meant to be there that aren't. This is the period where the rest of Europe loses interest in anti-Ottoman crusade. Varna is a big enough disaster for a lot of other European princes and powers that they do not see a purpose to it. The only ones that see a purpose to it are the people having to actually face it. Then, of course, there's the first siege of Belgrade, the failed siege of Belgrade by the Ottomans, that is regarded as one of the great victories of the period and is the last big Ottoman thrust into the realm of Saint Stephen. Well, the realm of Saint Stephen and northwards into Europe for 50 years. It had as much of a chance of working as not, but what it banks on, what most of the sieges bank on, what the defense of the realm banked on at this point, was that to outlast the Ottoman campaigning season. If you can survive, if a fortress can survive a siege from late spring to autumn, then it is considered a success. All you need to do is outlast the Ottoman campaigning season, and that's how you would basically. That is what the defense of the realm starts to try and do at this point. Now, this is a bit of also a question, because at points you're not exactly facing the big. There's a difference when you're facing an army of one of the bordering beys and pashas, and when you're facing the army of the Sultan proper, and which is a different scale of army. And this was the last time before the campaigns of the 1520s that the Sultan takes an interest in going northwards personally. This was the instance where the defensive system of the realm, with all of the different feudal lords and everybody, manages to somehow cooperate, but this is also because the people that are tied together here, are tied with familial bonds, like the Hunyadis and sorry, I'm forgetting the other family. this was the Silagi, yes, Silagi, sorry. Because this was yes, Silagi, thank you. This was also the era that apparently the whole constitutional system of the realm is sort of, there's an attempted restoration to what the feudal nobility considered to be an ideal after the reign of Sigismund, and that system relied on familial dynastic cooperation and obedience of office holders, and the whole cooperation of the system of state in order to ensure the defense. Now, in the case of the Siege of Belgrade, it kinda sort of worked. This is also because the system, the defensive system at this point, is not as exhausted as it will be 70 years earlier. The Ottomans are still only harassing in Bosnia, they're harassing Serbia, they're harassing in Vlachia, but they're not going after these fortifications proper in the 1450s. What we get with the big dynastic change, that is to say with the coming to the throne of Matthias, is a centralized power of the Ottoman Sultan meeting a centralizing power that Matthias is attempting to do. And Matthias appears to have been keenly aware of his military capabilities as to what he can and cannot do. There is a brief the campaigns he does take against the Ottomans are cautious. They watch where the Ottomans are. He will retreat when the Sultan shows up. He does not want to face the Sultan head on because he knows that if he is defeated, if his army goes, his entire system of rulership also goes with it. Because the Black Army is not only his big tool of defense, it is also his big tool of internal enforcement. Would a more unified Balkan state outlast the Ottomans? I mean, the sort of thing that happens from Sigismund onwards is that there is what happens from the reign of Louis I d'Anjou and then King Sigismund is that the Balkans, most of the Balkans, is effectively under Hungarian hegemony, under the hegemony of the Hungarian king. All of the rulers across the border have in some way, at some points or others, sworn vassalage to the king of Hungary, to Sigismund at this point. And that is the sort of idea that Sigismund went with. That the difference, I think, is that there is not an awareness on how to deal with the Ottoman threat, because the Ottoman threat does not come in the form of this big, huge army. That is not something that is frequent. That is something that will make the big pushes, take the big fortresses, make the big gains. But the main method of Ottoman expansion is raiding. I don't think it's even that it was technologically more advanced. It was just raw mobility and just raiding culture that nobody knew how to deal with until they are right at your doorstep. It's sort of, you don't hear the story of a giant army coming towards you. You're not going to react the same way if it's a small raiding party, and it sort of starts slowly encroaching on you. And the European system was to try and outlast the raiders. So you'd have big castles that would protect the population and from some raiders. You would have a sortie to try and clear them out. You would have those sorts of things. And the point here isn't that you wouldn't successfully throw out the raiders. You would. but you would have to do so again and again and again and again and again to the point of exhaustion of both the economic and the military system. It's the sort of reason the why at the point of the Battle of Mohacs there is hardly any heavy cavalry left in the Hungarian army, is because most of the cavalry has discarded its armor. They cannot chase raiders that way, and it costs quite a bit of money to try and keep up that lifestyle, that well, both military and lifestyle. And you see that with, I mean, the reign of King Matthias is to be in constant search of more money to finance the army. He needs to finance both the army and the idea of the fortress defensive system that succeeds in a way. We don't really know whether or not it would have been successful had the Hunyadi rule continued through the 1490s and onwards, because it's very hard to say. And you have those stories of, like, there would be raids against Matthias's border system. They wouldn't be as large or as threatening, but that is also probably because the system is dealing with them. And you also have these sort of diplomatic shenanigans that might have been going on between Matthias and the Sultan to, sure, you can pass through our border as long as you harm my enemy in Austria, Emperor Frederick III. It is something that is more likely than not happened, considering the shenanigans Frederick III and Matthias do against each other, even with regards to financing rebellions in each other's realms. And yet they keep calling each other father and son. Which is always a fun aspect of history. The collapse of Matthias's centralized rule, the end of Matthias's centralized rule, of course, brings the big change of administration. It is a reactionary revolution in the 1490s, so to say, of the feudal nobility to regain their decentralized method of living, but this also coincides with the time where Ottoman raids are right on the border. They are becoming more and more destructive and more frequent. At this point, there is no deal with King Matthias and the Sultan. There is no border kingdom protecting them, and there is no money for the financing of the border system anymore. And no centralized army that can react, no centralized army or command structure that can react to border incursions in a sufficient manner. And the Ottomans get better and better at sort of raiding, and the Battle of Krbava Field is not really a battle against an army that is trying to besiege something. It is an attack on a returning Ottoman raid from Austria with the aim to rob the raiders. Well, rob the raiders and decrease that big force, but that is something that the Croatian nobility had been doing at this point for probably decades, attacking Ottomans while they are on their return trip from Austria or Italy, and then grabbing all the goodies for themselves. And the Krbava Field is just a complete failure to counter that. How destructive the Battle of Krbava Field is like, the traditional narrative is that it is a complete and utter disaster, but apparently the amount of people that survive the battle is greater than that legendary killing of the flower of the Croatian nobility. But there is still some fight in the system. There is still, this is the 1490s still. The system isn't exactly collapsing. This is just, it is this a disaster that portends the things to come. And as the raids across the border intensify, the Ottomans are also realizing that the kingdom is far more vulnerable than it was before. There's no more reaction, there's no more quick reactions to the raids. There's a lot of the big feudal magnates and the nobility are left to themselves. The big structure of the Banates, especially the Banate that included the fortress of Belgrade, is effectively dismantled during the reign of Vladislav II, because territories that it had under it to finance the fortress of Belgrade are taken away from them. I think it's the Banat of Thames. Are taken away from it. So by the time of 1521, the Banate of Belgrade does not have the Banate that includes Belgrade does not have under its command anymore all of the resources that it used to have in 1456. And then, of course, it is the absolutely earth-shaking geopolitical event that is the Italian Wars. The Italian Wars are not talked about enough, in a way that they are probably the first great big European war of the early modern era. And it is a war for hegemony over the most prosperous, over the most educated, over the richest provinces in Europe. That is in northern Italy and Naples and Sicily. Whoever wins Italy would have a huge advantage over the other powers in Europe. That is why it is an earth-shaking event when the French king goes in and attempts to take Naples for his own. And why for the next 30 years, not 30 years, for the next 60 years, even longer than this 1559 date, Europe will be obsessed with who controls Italy. It will be the obsession of the French kings to attempt to take control over Italy. This also coincides with the birth of the unexpected birth of the Habsburg hegemony, with the attempted Habsburg hegemony and the Spanish succession, which is I would argue, an unexpected event, because when Maximilian makes the big marriage deals that get his son, connections to the Kingdom of Spain, it is not the combined realms of Spain. It is not expected that the heirs to the Spanish crowns will just start dying right one after the other. So you have these two big events completely and utterly distracting Europe from what's going on what's going on with the Ottoman advance, even though everyone in Europe is sort of screaming about the Ottoman threat, but little is being done because it is being used far more as a tool of blaming other people for following their selfish interests instead of doing this thing for the common good. The French will accuse the Habsburgs. Habsburgs will, we would help if the French would only go with it, and so on and so forth. Then you have the problems that the Catholic Church is finding itself in from the outset of the... the Italian Wars start with the Borgia papacy, and then... Excuse me? And then the papacy gets entangled into this very, very temporal conflict in a time where that is very, very frowned up, is going to be very, very frowned upon. And the from the statements of the different bishops and the different abbots and reformers within the church at the Lateran Council, it is clearly visible that there is a problem, a very big problem with this temporal involvement and lack of reformist effort from the part of the papacy. It doesn't help that a lot of the popes at this point also start coming in from the big influential Italian families such as the Medicis, where they are also tied in different ways to either the Habsburgs or the French. So you have this big distraction from what's going on in the Balkans. This, of course, combines into a perfect storm of events, with everything striking at both internal and external, striking at the same moment to begin this slow and then sudden collapse. The 1520s, you start getting the entire first line of border fortresses just starts falling one after the other, and then the big one of Belgrade that just falls without receiving any aid is a complete disaster and a nightmare. What doesn't really happen after Belgrade is that the Ottomans there's no rallying around the flag. There's no unification of effort anymore. The European powers don't trust that, are entangled even more in their own conflicts, especially with the succession of Charles V, where if only he could defeat the French king, or if only the French king would defeat the Habsburgs, then they would all unite and go after the Ottomans, but that doesn't happen. But Charles V is extremely close at that point to control over most of Europe, because he has the alliance with the Jagiellon dynasty, which ties in Hungary and Poland. He controls the Holy Roman Empire. He controls most of Italy. He's allied with the Medicis and consequently the Pope. He controls Spain. He will marry into the family of Portugal. He is marrying to the family of the King of England. It is the only puzzle piece left out of that block is France, and France is always the most populous and most centralized part of Europe, which gives the French kings this power to outlast their enemies that the Habsburgs just don't have. This thing with France being the most populous centralized country in Europe is a thing that has to be kept in mind for, centuries from this point onwards. It is the feature of everything from the Italian Wars to the wars of Louis XIV to the wars of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, is this factor that France is the most populous country in Europe. United country in Europe. But getting back to this, it is when we get to the Battle of Mohacs, we have been through about 30 years of internal decline and disagreement and rise of the power of the decentralized feudal nobility, which favors decentralization. But they also, as the Ottomans are encroaching in on their properties and lands, they are more eager to defend their own lands than they are to cooperate in a common defense. And we see that with first with the decisions of the diets in the early reign of Louis II, where the feudal nobility refuses to enacts that not refuse but enacts that the military commanders of the different sections cannot just on their own go and help another section or interfere into the business of another section. And that is sort of meant to as a measure to clear up authority and overlaps of authority which were also a problem, but it results in, well, people not helping each other anymore. And you also have the estates of the different kingdoms and different counties no longer cooperating or wanting to help defend somebody else at their own cost, because they fear if they spend their efforts in defense of somewhere else, they will become vulnerable. That is the case with the estates of Slavonia and this relationship between the estates of Slavonia and the estates of Croatia, which are in a more unique position because their political and military leader is one and the same person, the Ban of Dalmatia, Croatia, and Slavonia, which isn't exactly occurring in a few other parts of the realm. And there's also the fact that as independent kingdoms, they have a bit more of a say in their affairs than, well, not in autonomous kingdoms, they have a bit more of a say in their affairs than the individual county nobility do. But the disaster of Mohacs is not a matter of just the mistakes of that year, which were catastrophic. It is the result of decades of absolute collapse. And the interesting thing from the Battle of Mohacs is one of those also rare battles of this period where we do have eyewitness testimony, mainly in the form of Stephen Brodaric, who writes down his own record of the battle. And then you have I think one of the Ottoman chronicles by by Ibrahim Ali Begovic Pechevia, who writes a history about 50, well, he's born 50 years later, but he writes a history about at the beginning of around the 1600, I think he begins writing, where he uses other sources and other previous sources and other witness testimony to write his own history, to write an Ottoman history of the battle. And there are some differences between the two accounts, but they fall into the, let's say, the common tropes of different how battles are retold. So when, for instance, both sources will always claim an overwhelming might of the enemy. No matter what battle you're in, no matter what retelling of battle you see, the enemy is always more numerous than you are. Or at best, or if they always seem more numerous than you are. So Pecheri will describe this discharge of a huge Hungarian army under Tomori Bali down up towards the Sultan. Well, but towards the Ottoman army, and describes how the Ottoman forces closed ranks and withheld that massive big charge. Well, Brodaric will of course say that the Ottomans were about 3 times bigger, had 3 times the size of a force than they actually had. Well, he says that Tomori says that he himself puts the number at an effective strength of 70,000 of regular army, and then a few tens of thousands more of an army of hangers-on and other not as effective soldiery. But it still is a bigger force than it is assumed to have been. Excuse me. Just taking a sip of water. uh, you also you will. You also have a few more retellings and things of the Battle of Mohacs, but I didn't go quite into them as I did these two sources. But even Pechevia, I think, even Pechevia at the end of his own retelling of it inserts a quote unquote infidels retelling of the Battle of Mohacs, where he pretty much retells everything that was written by Broderic without his own additions or a third person narrative that he adds before, because he also tends to go on about how his family served the Sultan in campaigns in Iran and so on and so forth, and his own history and those sorts of things. It's the same thing that Broderic does when he. It's the same thing what Broderic does when he inserts his own what he told the king. Now the problem with eyewitness accounts that the eyewitness accounts that may have been used are lost. The chronicles he is quoting, some of the other retellings he may be quoting are also likely lost. He may be retelling are also likely lost. Sadly, there's rarely a practice of writers actually telling us where they got their materials from. Like when the thing that he does is by retelling this very similar telling to what Broderic says, is he says an infidel's retelling. He doesn't say I found this and this was written by Stephen Broderic. He just says an infidel's retelling of the Battle of Mohacs. Or a translation of that, but there was no practice of sadly there was no practice of referencing things in chronicle writing. It just tended to it's not exactly the most fun thing to write when you do have to write it, and you sort of have to understand both the writer and the just resources in writing involved at the time. Plus, probably the lack of modern day intellectual rigor on everybody's part. Nobody's going to punish you for not adding in your sources, so to say. But there's also the Ottomans. What Ottoman sources are famous for is tax records, and those are incredibly well preserved even to this day, and likely they were used as sources back then. But just to finish off this section is that what we do get in a lot of things is that this entire the tendencies of the tendencies that are exhibited among statecraft and military craft is that a decentralized force, a decentralized feudal European force that has been used to fighting in a certain way, in a certain culture, in a certain political system, is not up to the task of facing a very, very centrally controlled enemy. The big question for me is, and it's an almost unanswerable question, what would have happened when the Ottomans reached the border? What would have happened if King Matthias had lived? What would have happened if his chosen heir had managed to take the throne and retain the Black Army and the centrally controlled kingdom? Those are sort of big questions that you'll never get the answer to, because both the situation internally and externally are different at this point. It is also as likely that King Matthias might have completely disregarded the Ottoman defense and joined the Italian wars had he lived another 4 or 5 years, which could have been a complete and utter disaster, but as well it could have been an effective defense. We just don't know, and we will never know because of the way history turns out. But the Jagiellonian kings came from a very different cultural milieu, that from Poland and from Bohemia, that basically taught them about that decentralized rule works, that being this constitutional monarch will work out for you within the manner of at least retaining the crown, which was, without the Ottoman threat, the most anybody had to worry about. The Ottoman threat adds in this very different thing to European politics that didn't exist before. Before, you kind of sort of could have held out an external enemy as long as you retained internal support, and everybody is far more keen to retain that than they are to start prepping the centralized realm for external efforts. This of course changes on here with, well, the different when with King Matthias, and then I mean there's the parallel developments of King Matthias in Hungary, and then the kings of France finally ousting the English and centralizing their power within France. That are two exceptions in Europe as to this development. Arguably, there's also that sort of movement in England too under the Tudors, but it's the problem is that England is still an island, and it doesn't really exert itself much on the European stage it tries to, but it doesn't really succeed in exerting itself either on the Isles, well, except in Ireland, but not really on the European stage. It's still a factor, but it's not a proactive factor, let's say, until colonialism starts and the Protestantism spreads and that whole shebang starts. But I think I've said most of the things I wanted to about Mohacs and everything. So, any questions and things? Anything? The perception of the Jagiellonian kings is mostly ineffectiveness. It is kings that are glossed over in the history books. They tend to be mentioned in up to 3 pages, and then they're gone. There's not much impact of them. There's not much record of impact because it's just assumed that. Oof, I do not like my model twitching, but yeah, they are not exactly regarded at all. Like, there is some amount of Louis II being this tragic figure, but that mostly comes down to it being both tragic, as in the sense of dying at the Battle of Mohacs, and then that narrative of his life being neglected, being disregarded by his counselors. Those sorts of stories tend to also reflect that he was uneducated, that he was neglected, that he was left alone in the castle for nobody cared about him, nobody did anything with him. those sorts of things, even though they're not necessarily true stories, considering he has an active role. He has an active role, at least within marriage. Well, at least the fact that he gets married to, he completes the marriage alliance with the Habsburgs and attempts to negotiate with his in-laws and cousins and his uncle or things. So he is a big factor in trying to rally support, but it's generally Louis II is regarded as a tragic figure. Vladislav II is this king between Matthias, is this ineffective king between Matthias and Louis, and Vladislav I is, I would argue, unknown. He is relatively unknown. The Battle of Varna is more known than the fact that Vladislav was king of Hungary and Croatia, that sort of thing. It's this weird thing that there's not much about. That entire period between King Sigismund and King Matthias is a bit. It's not talked about enough and not and relatively unknown. I mean, I would say from what I've saw, and it tends to get glossed over in about 2 pages of a history book, while 10 times or 20 pages are dedicated, 10, 20, 30 pages are dedicated to Sigismund and Matthias. I mean, that tends to be also because it's yeah, Vladislav II. Yeah, Vladislav II I think, got called the king who always said, "So it's all right. I agree to everything that was said at the royal council meetings." I think one of the historians describes him in this role of constitutional monarch who didn't argue, who didn't argue, who was always in agreement with his counselors, who never really asserted himself. And that partially comes from the start of his rule in Bohemia, where even as a kid he is subjected to this overwhelming power of the nobility around him. Yes, I am. Honestly, I will start looking into right now sorry. I will start looking into a few other to continuing this whole story with with the Habsburgs and Zapolya and the Civil War, and see how how the script construct and the elections of the kings and everything, and how the script construction goes for that. There are a few ideas I'm tossing around for shorter content, but I'm in a bit of a stunted phase that I think requires just probably a week of peace and quiet or something that I'm not getting from my regular job and everything, but that's another matter. But I will come up with something now that this is finally over with. Going to start working on continuing with mainly with the elections. Next thing is going to be the elections of Zapolya and Ferdinand, and then we'll see how much history that tends to cover, and how many episodes and things that could be, and probably going to talk about a bit of the condensed history of the Habsburg dynasty up to Frederick III, probably, because you can really separate the Habsburgs before Frederick III and after Frederick III into 2 separate dynasties in how they react, because before Frederick III they are far more normal German dynasty that splits its estates between its sons, and it's this whole decentralized mess as happens in Bavaria and all over the Holy Roman Empire. And after Frederick III, you get this tendency towards centralization. I will definitely see how quickly I can get to sort of the military frontier, because that is an that is a system that is not that well known. It is. It tends to be a period of. It tends to be, again, this very tragic period. I can't remember right now any specifics about it in literature. Contemporaneously, you get far more. Contemporaneously, there's far more literacy on the Dalmatian coast, but they tend to talk about their own problems with the Ottoman raids and those sorts of things. It's a period that is looked on in a generally sad light, but I can't remember the specifics right now. You get a lot more literature and things regarding the whole situation on the border, and generally fighting the Ottomans in later periods that are written with various purposes in mind, from Gundulich's Osman II, which is an epic poem. Then you have Ottomans being featured in sort of different functions in different literary functions and plot devices, and talks about from the monstrous to from being the boogeyman to being very common. I think there's a lot more writing about the period after Mohacs, about the period, or that takes place in the periods after Mohacs. But that is also the era where the defensive system is established, where even more sources can be found, again, because places actually survived Ottoman raids or begin to. So that tends to start happening. As for what I'm gonna do next, I'm going to think of what I can do in a shorter format for the next few weeks, and then it's back to the research grindstone to continue seeing what I can do, and hopefully a few ideas come up from just general reading for leisure, because right now I'm in the midst of a biography of Winston Churchill that one little short video came from, and there's a few interesting short stories that would make for shorter format videos, but that's not exactly confirmed to be a plan. I might also make a few shorter videos about some heraldic or vexillologic, coats of arms and flags, and general information about Croatia and things. I've also have a few ideas for comics in my head that would have some fun with those things. But yeah, I'm a bit tired of everything and haven't had exactly a time to rest, so I'm a bit dry on concrete plans and ideas. But I'll be back. it usually takes about a week or two to get back into it. Any more questions? Thank you. Thank you. Okay, well, thank you all for coming to this little talk for this little ramble about the history of Battle of Mohacs. I'll see if I can come up with something else to ramble about next week or in 2 weeks. Probably in 2 weeks, but you'll see things scheduled. Well, thank you for watching, and we will be continuing this. So, see you next time.